Welcome to Sparking Equity, a podcast highlighting strategies to ensure all students succeed and have the opportunity to learn. I'm Pedro Noguera, Dean of the USC Rossier School of Education.
And I'm Freedberg, Director of the Advancing Education Success Initiative and Executive Producer of this podcast.
The structure of the school day for most students has been more or less the same for the last 125 years. Each school day consists of 6 or sometimes 7 periods, each lasting 40 to 60 minutes.
Yes, Pedro, it's been based on what is known as the Carnegie Unit, which was the brainchild of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, which was set up by steel magnate and philanthropist Andrew Carnegie in 1906.
Most of our listeners will know it as the credit hour. The Carnegie Foundation also decreed that students needed to amass a minimum of 14 credit hours in order to apply to college, with each credit hour consisting of 120 hours of instruction over the school year.
But fascinatingly, the Carnegie Foundation, which invented the Carnegie Unit, is now at the forefront of a big push happening across the country to abandon it. And Pedro, interestingly, I found out that if you ask most people, including people who are working in the schools every day, about the Carnegie Unit, they'd most likely may not even have heard about it or only have a very vague idea of its potent impact on their lives and, more importantly, of the lives of their students.
That's true, but it's built into policy, it's built into practice, and it's one of the things that has been so consistent for so many years that it's amazing that it hasn't been changed. Truth is, though, it doesn't seem to be working well for lots of students, maybe even most students, particularly as they enter high school. Today, we're happy to have with us two leaders who are trying to reform the basic structure of the school day. One is Tim Knowles, who is president of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, based in Menlo Park, California. Welcome, Tim. Good to see you.
Thank you both.
Also with us is Laura Slover, Managing Director of Skills for the Future, a joint initiative of ETS and the Carnegie Foundation. Welcome, Laura.
Great to be here. Thank you.
And I know you and Tim have been working closely together on this very issue.
Yes, we have. It's been a lot of fun.
So let's start with Tim. Since you are now the president of Carnegie, and so I guess you have some ownership of this, tell us why this idea came into being in the first place. I know Harvard had something to do with it, Charles Eliot, didn't he?
It was established in 1906, the Carnegie Unit, or in today's parlance, the credit hour. It was used as a way to determine what was going on a school on the Western Front and how you could compare that to a school like Boston Latin in Boston, the first public school, such that colleges and universities like Harvard could actually determine what young people had been up to. Since then, it's really become the bedrock currency of the educational economy, as you suggested. It's infiltrated everything from it shapes the day of a teacher, of a student. It defines what's taught and assessed. It's what goes on a transcript, what counts as accreditation. It's who gets financial aid and who doesn't. So it isn't just part of the system. It really is the system.
So explain to us why the foundation is now trying to change it. It seems like standardization is necessary in education. You need to know, as you just pointed out, that when a student applies, that they have more or less had a kind of equivalent education. Why would we want to change this?
What we really want to know is whether young people know things and can do things, right? That's what we should be standardizing. I think what it was never intended to be was a proxy for learning, and that's what it became. So the conflation of time and learning is at the root of the problem, and we need to address it now for all kinds of reasons. One, it was established in 1906, so it basically ignores everything we've learned from neuroscientists, cognitive psychologists, psychologists about learning and about how we learn and how knowledge is acquired. We know now that you learn from experience, from solving real problems, from working with peers, from internships and apprenticeships, and individuals learn at highly variable rates, depending on the person and the subject of study. So the second problem is, I would argue, that it's fundamentally stymied innovation. We've had examples of, for example, competency-based learning in every state in the nation. Since Dewey and Montessori, we've had really interesting, elegant not time-bound formulations of learning and teaching, but they've always existed at the edges. They've been at the margins and not the mainstream. So that is the real challenge, in my view, is how do you bring the modalities of teaching to a much broader scale that we know actually work for more young people? And the third point I would just make is I think it's stymied economic growth and opportunity for our country in a more fundamental way. Raj Chetty and other economists have tracked very carefully economic mobility and social and economic mobility over the last 60 or 80 years. And it's, as we, I think, all know, is plummeting. And while the Carnegie unit isn't the only cause for that by any imagination, I think it's something we have to tackle if we want our schools to be much more vital engines for economic opportunity.
Let's bring Laura in to the conversation. Laura, you're the Managing Director of Skills for the Future, which, as we mentioned, is a joint initiative of ETS, the Educational Testing Service, and Carnegie Foundation. Laura, as you've been thinking about this issue, I'm reminded of the fact that usually the complaint I hear most from students is that school is boring and not relevant. Will these reforms that you're thinking about address those two criticisms?
Yes, that is the hope, and that's the plan. Tim talked about how the current system has really stymied innovation and doesn't reflect the way we learn. It's also kind of boring, as you mentioned. And one of the reasons to move towards competency-based approaches is that it allows the school day to be deconstructed from those very rigid 45-minute class periods and to really focus intentionally on outcomes. What is a student learning as opposed to how long are they sitting in that classroom? And learning, as we know, takes place in lots of different environments, lots of different configurations. And the competency-based approach allows for much more interdisciplinary and creative and student-centered approaches to learning.
For listeners who may not be familiar with the competency-based approach, just briefly, what does that consist of? What kind of competencies are we talking about?
Well, in a competency-based system, credit is based on progress or mastery or outcomes instead of seat time. So remember, we were talking about, you need certain amount of credits in order to go through high school and get into college. Those are based on time and conflate time with learning. So in a competency-based system, you're no longer required to administer these fixed 50-minute dosages, quote unquote, of English or math or science or history. But rather there are much more fluid ways of learning, whether it's through interdisciplinary work, through projects. Oftentimes work is completed outside the school building through jobs or internships, et cetera. So it just kind of shifts the whole dynamic from one that is time-based to one that is outcomes-based.
So Laura, I like the focus on learning and the evidence of learning, but not that long ago, we thought that standardized tests would give us the evidence we needed. Are you saying we need to move away from using high-stakes testing as the primary barometer of learning and adopt new approaches?
Well, I've been involved in state-level high-stakes testing for most of my career. And so if you look at my history, I have a background in large-scale assessment. And I think it has really helped move the system towards a more equitable system and helped ensure that all kids get exposure to rich content. And yet what it doesn't do is to capture learning in the moment and in the places where students are learning. So rather than think about this as an instead of, I think it's a very important addition to the way we've thought about schooling. Currently, when we think about GPAs or transcripts, we think only about math, English, social studies, science. And a student is kind of equivalent with their GPA. And that's just a very flat way of thinking about learning, but also about individuals. Individuals are different and unique, and some of them are great critical thinkers and communicators, but they may not have an A in a class that reflects that. So what we're reaching towards is a more three-dimensional view of students, that they become the best version of themselves through an asset-based system, rather than the negative-based view of them, which is, oh, I didn't get an A in this, so I'm not an expert. So we're trying to decouple assessments from academic progress, not say assessments aren't important in capturing what students can do, but that they don't reflect everything a student can do.
You're working with ETS now on rethinking the Carnegie Unit, I guess by extension, Rethinking the School Day. So what is ETS's interest in this? And just fill us in on what you're working with. And I understand you're working in 5 states now to launch some very interesting initiatives.
Yes, well, this Skills for the Future initiative is a partnership between ETS and the Carnegie Foundation. So I have my foot in sort of both organizations as we work really closely together. ETS's interest is that there's a new emphasis on skills and durable skills. We now know through research done in part by ETS and Carnegie that whereas math and English and your scores in those used to be proxies for readiness for college or readiness for good jobs, now it's really the skills that are the most predictive, these durable skills like communication, collaboration, critical thinking, adaptability, resilience, and that young people who have those and develop those and have evidence of those are more likely to be successful in the workplace and in college. So ETS is really at the forefront of thinking about how measurement needs to change to capture that learning, but also to drive that learning.
We're talking with Tim Knowles, president of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, and Laura Slover, managing director of the Skills for the Future initiative.
Let's bring Tim back in. Tim, one of the things we hear often is that the assessments as we have them now don't measure things like the ability of a student to collaborate, work with other people, communicate clearly, to be creative and be a good problem solver. Will the reforms you're looking at address that need?
I think for those of us who've been in this for a while, we know that the aperture is pretty narrow in terms of what those multiple choice tests actually measure and what they predict. So yes, algebra and reading, of course, they still matter. And as Laura was saying, we need to include this other set of skills and dispositions that young people need to be successful, not just in school, but in work and in civic life. What you see popping up in states is this very high appetite among broad range of stakeholders for us to think about the core purposes of schooling in a different way. But really what we're after is engaging rigorous, experiential, effective learning, wherever that happens, in school or outside of school. If you imagine a kid growing up in rural Iowa who gets up in the morning and works on the family farm for 2 hours before she gets to school, then goes to high school, gets her homework in time, is attending 97% of the time, is getting B's or better, and then has a job after school or on the weekends. On aggregate, tell me those aren't signals of persistence. Those are the kinds of signals we want to capture and then make legible to post-secondary institutions and the workforce, to employers, in ways that we think will be really good for young people and will be really good for the economy.
In our last episode, we looked at big picture schools, and they're doing internships. And 2 days of the week, the students are out of the classroom and really shaking up this school week. I'm just wondering, changing anything as basic as, people get into habits, and a lot of parents, we like those habits every morning at certain times. And when you start shaking that up, that's difficult. How much progress, how much receptivity is there to this notion that we need to rethink, and you are saying, and many others, in a fundamental way?
I would say that the demand that we're seeing across urban, rural, suburban, red, blue, purple is extraordinarily high for a shift. I think it's partly born of deep frustrations with, for example, the chronic attendance numbers that we're seeing. Young people are voting with their feet, Pedro. The NAEP results in reading are as low as they've ever been. So there's a palpable and cross-cutting view that what we've been doing is not serving young people or preparing them for the economy that they face. So states like Indiana are upending their whole high school diploma, the definition of a high school diploma, to allow young people to actually get credentialed in something real that has value, not just in the state, but the nation. So I think the demand and appetite, both among educators, policymakers, parents, and families, for shifting away from the Carnegie Unit in particular, whether people know the name of it or not, is significant. Laura?
I'll just add that, and I think Tim mentioned this earlier, nearly half the states are moving towards this idea of a portrait of a graduate that really is a broader set of things beyond just the courses they need to take, but the kind of dispositions and habits that you want a graduate to have. So again, things like being a critical thinker, things like being adaptive. That signals the shift. And specifically in our work, we are working with 5 states very closely. Tim mentioned Indiana. There's 4 other states, Wisconsin, Nevada, Rhode Island, and North Carolina, that are working with us to co-design tools and to test them out. The assessments that these states are co-designing are really not the fill-in-the-bubble kinds of tests, but rather experiences and activities in which there's collaboration and communication. So they're going to look and feel quite different. And I think that contributes toward this new architecture that these states are working on.
So I think it would be good now to bring up the NAEP scores, the nation's report card, which just came out, which shows we're still far behind from pre-pandemic levels, big gaps in learning. And then the TIM scores, which show the international comparison, we're really far behind, particularly in math. Are you thinking that the kind of changes you're working on will address these noticeable gaps in academic performance for American kids?
I think if you look at, for example, big picture and their results, or you look at the outcomes of young people who've been involved in a growing number of career and technical programs who are building drones and flying drones and building companies, doing cybersecurity, you see some pretty promising evidence that young people who do the kinds of learning that we've been talking about are engaged, whatever the name of it is, that their results are significantly better than young people who are going through the paces at a very traditional high school with a 7-period day and sort of just getting through. And that doesn't take into consideration the 50% or more who are chronically absent. So I think the short answer is yes, Pedro. If we get to richer, more engaging and experiential learning experiences, particularly for high school students, we are going to accelerate results, and we're going to open up opportunities for young people, whether that's post-secondary opportunities or opportunities in the workforce.
Particularly when those experiences start to count. Many of those experiences in traditional high schools are sort of invisible because they happen outside of school and they're not happening within a class for credit. And moving towards a different system where you broaden the aperture of what matters means that some of those experiences will actually count and enrich a student's overall portfolio.
We're having this conversation in the context of some very dramatic changes going on in the country with unknown consequences for education. One of the interesting things in looking at this issue about rethinking the school day, what kind of skills students should be acquiring, it's very bipartisan. This is not a kind of a left-right issue. And so this appears to open the door to potential areas of agreement that we or you could be working on in the next few years.
I think you're right, Louis. I sometimes refer to it after we did with ETS, the analysis of all the portraits of a graduate that we could get our hands on. It was almost as though we were looking at this invisible American consensus about the core purposes of schooling that is truly shared, rural, urban, red, blue, suburban, etc. And I think where we're seeing people lean in, whether it's places like Utah or Arizona or Rhode Island or North Carolina, Indiana, they're leaning in everywhere. So I do think there is an opportunity here to find some legitimate common ground about what we want for young people, which will set up many, many more of them for success.
All states, red, blue, rural, urban, are focused on equipping students for the world they're entering into, which includes helping them learn and develop their durable skills.
What do you think appeals to the right, people coming from that end of the political spectrum? What is it about the work you're doing that has that appeal?
Purposeful careers is something that everybody wants for young people, whether they're on the right or the left. That's the primary point of intersection, whether you're right or left or in the middle.
We've been focused on learning and assessment, but we haven't really talked about what teachers do to facilitate these changes. Any thoughts about both the preparation of teachers and teacher work itself. How will that look different in the years ahead, do you imagine?
Pedro, I'm worried about this because I actually think that we aren't paying nearly enough attention to what the future of teaching should be and what it will demand. I think a high school teacher in the next 10, 20 years should be teaching perhaps traditional classes a third of the time, should be curating learning for a group of students a third of the time, and then advising, individual coaching and support. I think that definition of teaching would be much more interesting for professionals across the country and much more attractive. Yet we don't have a lot of examples to point to where people are really breaking ground in terms of what is the role of the professional teacher in a world where young people can learn independently, they can learn in all kinds of contexts, and they still need some traditional instruction. So I think you're putting your finger on a big question that there's miles to go before we sleep.
We are working with a lot of educators across the 5 states as we implement these new tools, because A, they're on the front lines with learners, but also B, because this is going to have an impact on how they work with students, how they use the data from any of these tools. It's imperative that we involve teachers throughout this exploration and this transition. So it's not something that is done to them, but something that they are doing and leading. I'm a former teacher, so that's pretty important to me.
I do want to ask you about the equity implications of the work you are doing. Equity being a concept that's under direct assault. To what extent is the work you're doing reforming the school day important for students who historically have not achieved the levels that we would have liked and they would like?
I would say that a primary driver of this work is to ensure that America and American schools are fairer and more accelerative for everybody. And that begins with low-income young people, whatever their color, wherever they live across the country. It has to include underrepresented groups of young people, people who have not had access to institutions or excellent teaching and learning. And it has to include the young people who've been actively excluded from access to opportunity. So at the heart of this is a place of common ground for our country. We're trying to imagine and instantiate a new architecture for high school education in particular that will enable many, many more young people to prevail. So whether you like the word equity or not, wherever you are on that debate, this work we're talking about is for everybody.
Well, on that note, we need to wrap up this very rich and important conversation. I want to thank our guest, Tim Knowles. Great to be with you, Tim, after so many years, president of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, and Laura Slover, managing director of Skills for the Future, a joint initiative of the Carnegie Foundation and the Education Testing Service.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Thank you very much.
Well, Pedro, I'd love to get your thoughts on what Tim and Laura had to say. I mean, you're a dean of School of Education. You're in the trenches on this every day. Just how important do you think these efforts to restructure the school day are?
Well, you know, having been in this field for so long, one of the things that makes me somewhat cynical is we've been here before. We've talked about these issues before. John Goodlad wrote a book many years ago criticizing the curriculum in high schools as being a mile wide and inch deep, you know, that we were covering material but not providing deep learning. But how much has changed? And it raises the question, what will drive change? What will lead to real transformation in schools? We only touched on teaching at the very end, and Tim expressed some of his concerns about how do you really change the ways in which teachers work and engage students. So I'm not so cynical I don't believe it can be done. I just know we've tried many things before that really haven't panned out the way we hope.
But what do you think about, we touched on this in our discussion with Tim and Laura about the fact that there seems to be I would say consensus, maybe overstating it, but there's a lot of support coming from the right. I mean, that's part of their critique of not only K-12, but higher ed, that it's sort of disconnected from the work world and only caters to a certain set of students. Isn't that a foundation that you could really build on?
I think so, but let's keep in mind, a lot of the criticism of high-stakes testing came from the right as well. And states like New Hampshire began pushing things like formative assessments to move away from the multiple choice tests that we give kids, but it didn't really take hold. And that's because change is hard. And I think that the state departments of education and the federal government are not the ones driving change. It changes to the degree it happens. It's happening at the level of schools and districts. And you think about the big picture schools, which we talked about. Those schools have been around, they've been growing, and they've been doing amazing work, but it hasn't really taken off and influenced other schools. Sometimes even in the same building, you'll have kids who are part of a big picture school who are inspired about what they're doing, and it has no impact at all on the rest of the schools. And I think that's a question we have to ask, why? Why is it that change in education occurs so slowly and sometimes not at all?
Well, isn't a lot of this habit? I mean, this is the way things have been done. And also, once you start shaking up, which has turned out to be a rather rigid structure, it's more complicated. It is more demanding. Kids aren't here some of the day. I mean, somebody has to keep track of that. And you got to figure out how they're going to, get through the curriculum and so on. It makes things more complicated.
Much more complicated. And I think if you don't have leaders at multiple levels, not just superintendents, but principals who have a clear vision of not just what change is needed, but how to bring it about, it won't happen. But I'm also thinking about the work of Michael Fullan, who's written about the drivers of change. And in documenting the dramatic changes that took place in Toronto, he says, we focus in the US on assessment as a driver of change, whereas in Toronto, they focused on building the capacity of the educators. And I don't really hear a strategy for doing that so far in this discussion.
At the same time, I've been really struck and somewhat moved by the fact that the inventor of the Carnegie Unit, the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, is actually at the forefront of trying to change it. That seems remarkable. They're not sitting here trying to defend it, just the opposite. They are making a really compelling case as to why it's outlived its usefulness. And then getting ETS involved also, I think, seems significant.
I'm taken by what Laura said at the end. When I raised the point about teaching, she said, well, I was a teacher myself, and we want to do this with teachers, not to teachers. And that, I think, is a good point, if they, in fact, follow through on that. Teachers have to lead this work in many ways. Otherwise, it really won't happen.
And wouldn't you say, just intuitively, that most teachers would prefer this? Nobody likes to be in lockstep and every day the same period, the same this, the same that. It would make their lives more interesting.
I think it would make the teaching profession more attractive. If we told teachers they get to be more creative in the way they go about presenting material and engaging students, I think you could attract lots of people right now who don't see teaching as a career into the profession, and that would be a good thing. Well, on that note, we have to wrap up this episode of Sparking Equity. Thanks to our producer, Kobe McDonald and Eric Olson. Thanks also to our sponsors, the Hewlett Foundation and School Services of California, and to the USC staff for their support.
Please let us know about innovative ways you know about for rethinking the school day. You can write to us at sparkingequity@gmail.com.
And please be sure to subscribe to Sparking Equity, wherever you listen to your podcast. I'm Pedro Noguera.
And I'm Louis Freedberg. Thanks for listening.